Thanks for joining us for episode 2 of the Growth Minded podcast. On this podcast, we talk to business and community leaders in the Midwest to address various issues related to growing businesses at every stage. We also talk to best-selling authors and thought leaders about the ingredients that contribute to rapid top-line growth and value creation for your business. Today, we were lucky enough to have one such subject matter expert. This episode features the highly successful sales consultant and business author, John Holland. John launched Customer Centric Selling back in 2002, writing a popular book by the same name. The popularity of the book and the success of the consulting business have continued to grow for nearly 15 years, and today, Customer Centric Selling has more than 1,000 customers. The phrase Customer Centric Selling itself has made its way into common business vernacular. John joined us in the Growth Minded studios for a discussion that ranges from a few of the core principles for CCS to his own process for creating new content. We talked about financial impact selling, the metric revenue return on investment, and John gives us a small taste of his upcoming book as well. The podcast is 26 minutes of the best stuff from a discussion that was nearly 2 hours long, and it's filled with some great insights about some symptoms that your sales organization might be going through right now. The Growth Minded podcast is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The video version and show notes are available on YouTube and our podcast website, growthminded.io. I hope you enjoy it, and if you do, please share it with your friends and colleagues. That would mean a lot as we get this thing off the ground. And with that, let's get on with episode 2 of the Growth Minded podcast featuring John Holland. Enjoy it. John, thanks for taking the time to get together.
My pleasure, Todd.
Can we talk a little bit about customer-centric selling and the process of creating the book? If you go back to that time, was there a moment where you knew there was a book inside of you? And
I think there's always been a book inside me, but what happened was we had launched Customer Centric Selling in 2002, and we recognized that really to be on the map, I think 2 things were necessary. You have to have a book. You're no smarter than anyone else, but you have to have a book. And then secondly, you need a worldwide presence. So that was really the thinking behind writing a book. You don't get wealthy writing business books, I can tell you that, but it was a necessary step.
What was the process like at the time?
Really odd because I never wrote an outline. It just sort of flowed. And what I typically would do is, I'd get up, have breakfast. I like to start in the morning fresh. And I would write as long as I could. And some days it was a half hour, and some days it was 2 hours. And that's just the way I did it.
How often do you still create content, whether that be your blog or whatever content you're creating today?
The blog I do, every week. And I have another book in me that's this one. I've actually done an outline of things. So that's going to happen.
When you were writing customer-centric selling, were you leaning on somebody who could sort of mentor you through that process, or were you creating on your own?
No, I wouldn't say there was a mentor. And in fact, the first edition, I co-authored with Mike Bosworth, and we did get an editor because there were 2 different writing styles, but McGraw-Hill was real helpful with us about that.
The core principles in customer-centric selling, were those developed specifically for the book, or were they concepts that had evolved over time?
I'd say evolved over time and experience. I think in a lot of ways, customer-centric is in some ways just very simple logic and common sense, but I think that's at a premium, especially as relates to sales.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the key principles of customer-centric, which ones came first in your mind? What was there from day one?
No goal, no prospect. And what we mean by that, a salesperson can make a call, have a great conversation. They can talk fishing and football and business. But ultimately, if you have a buyer that doesn't share a goal or a problem they're willing to spend money to either achieve or fix, you just don't have a prospect. Mm-hmm. And, in my mind, it was valid in 2002. And I look today at the silliness that's going on with website leads and scoring leads. I'd apply the same concept. No goal, no prospect. So if someone's doing research and isn't aware of business issues, at some level, you got to pay for it. They're really not a lead.
What really stands out to you in terms of the other key principles?
What's ironic to me, Todd, is the fact that I don't think buyers or sellers are better off than they were 10, 15 years ago. And to me, it was really about the start of Y2K, and I'm glad we don't have to mention Y2K anymore. But, that to me became when the internet really started, business were posting information, and suddenly buyers didn't have to talk to salespeople. So that combined with social networking, probably LinkedIn, maybe 2005, 2006, really revolutionized the way, quote unquote opportunities were started. And the problem that I see is that most companies knew they had to give up the website activity because salespeople can't nurture. They got to make numbers this month, this quarter, this year. And what ultimately happened, they gave it to marketing. I think it was a huge step, but what marketing had never qualified leads. And so what happened is they had to winnow down the number of prospects. And what they did was they came up with a scoring approach. How many times did they visit the website? How many pages did they download a white paper? That means that that person is not an executive. So they're not buyers. And what happened is marketing has, and I'd say continues to treat them as buyers. And it's a tremendous mistake, at least in my mind. They really are potentially coaches that salespeople could maybe get to a higher level. And the irony is that all of the changes vendors have been made based upon non-decision makers and their activity. It's bizarre to me.
It's interesting. So that dovetails into the next question. Around 5 years ago, with the release of the Challenger sale, people began citing the statistic that 58% of the decision-making process is done before a buyer contacts a vendor. Today, the number people are using has actually increased to around 70%. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that let's first set the stage. I'll say a B2B transaction in excess of $50,000.
Great.
Arbitrarily, I picked that. If it's software as a service, $4,000 a month. What you really wind up with in that case is you've got people that are doing research, but they just can't buy. So what they're really doing, in my mind, Todd, is it's product evaluation. So I'll grant you 70% of product evaluations can be done. But when you talk about buying activity, before a company cuts a PO or issues a check, the vendors have to be vetted. There has to be an assessment of support. There are a whole bunch of other things that the budgeting has to be lined up. So it's to the point of the difference between researchers and buyers. Again, I'll come back. 70% of the product research can be done, but the buying activities, cost versus benefit, none of that's been done. So I strongly disagree with the contention that all that is buying activity. It's research activity.
One of my favorite key tenets of CCS is that you get delegated to the person you most sound like. Can we talk about that for a second?
Salespeople dream of getting in front of a CEO or a CFO, and it's sort of like me wishing I could get in the ring with a professional boxer. The good news is I got there. The bad news, the fight took 13 seconds. 3 seconds to knock me out and then count me out. So the real challenge is that people want to call on executives, but if they can't relate to them on business issues, and they start talking, especially if it's a technical product, confusing the buyer, they're going to get delegated. And that's really sad. When you're calling at a high level, you really have to, in my mind, relate to business issues and outcomes and usage. They don't want to know about products. And it's going to be a short and a violent meeting if a salesperson goes down that road. And the unfortunate thing to me, there's so much product training that salespeople become wind-up toys. And in today's environment, they never get to use the product training because the lower-level people, they do the research without them because they don't want to be influenced by sellers. And if they're in the C-suite, you can't use it. So I wish companies would cut 20% of their product training and invest in business training because I think that's the new salesperson. You have to make it a business proposition, not a product evaluation.
That's a great point. Another one is bad news early is good news. We spend a lot of time engaged with clients on the issues of opportunity cost and wasted time, wasted cycles. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No one likes to get bad news, and it's a question of when you get bad news. And I share with you, Todd, I had a CEO go through one of my workshops, and you've sat through a workshop yourself. And he stood up on day 2, and he said, my salespeople have a bad habit. I said, Bill, what's that? He says they lose slowly. So they love to have them in the pipeline, all that good stuff. But the bad news early is good news. you should know early on whether or not something's going to happen. So what happens in most cases is that salespeople confuse, the ones that are average salespeople, confuse activity with progress. Just because you have meetings doesn't mean it's moving in the right direction. And so there's actually buyer actions that should tell you whether or not you're in it to stay. So for example, you can't get access to high levels. Well, there's a red flag right there. I mean, if you get access, are they moving ahead? So what happens, and I think one of the key things in customer-centric selling, is that we enable a manager to monitor progress based upon buyer actions rather than seller opinions. And, the fact is, sellers hate to take things out of their pipeline, so they'll just leave them in. And, bad news, they're not going to happen. You might as well take them out so you have a realistic view of your pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Were there methodologies or particular selling processes that you encountered early in your career that impacted your thinking and got you on this path?
I would say that for first 20 years of my career in sales and sales management, there was no process. And I was first exposed to that in 1993 with solution selling, and that really opened my eyes. It was a great methodology, and it allows a salesperson to sell on purpose. And that sounds weird, but you actually have an idea of where you are and where the buyer is in the buying cycle. And, it just makes you more effective. And if you talk about bad news early is good news, when you self-assess, even without the help of your manager, you can tell whether or not it's a qualified opportunity.
In terms of buying behaviors and the evolution of those behaviors throughout the selling process or their buying process, does Neil Rackham factor in here anywhere?
Yeah, Rackham, in fact, it's funny. Another book I co-authored was Rethinking the Sell Cycle, and he was very gracious. He wrote the introduction for it. And we actually based customer-centric selling on his research on buying behavior. We figured if you want to be customer-centric, you ought to build the methodology around the way people buy. And so, I owe a big debt of gratitude to Neil Rackham, and we recognize him in the book with a footnote on the buying behavior curves that he created.
Since you wrote Rethinking the Sales Cycle, is there anything that leads you to believe that buying behaviors have changed where another sequel is due?
Very few companies have made a meaningful reaction to the differences in buying behavior or research behavior. Everyone acknowledges, Todd, as you said, that sales reps are getting involved later in opportunities, whether they're research or real opportunities. And yet, very few companies have said, we got to look at our selling approach. A traditional selling approach with a buyer who thinks they know what they want is going to yield a very poor buyer experience. And so my next book is actually going to be about aligning the silos of product development, product marketing, marketing, and sales. Because if you're going to be customer-centric, you really have to focus around the customer. And what happens is most product development, no fault of theirs, they're furthest away from the buyers in the market. In a semi-vacuum, they create an offering. Product marketing says, well, gee, which verticals can use this? Then marketing has to campaign and, brochures and collateral and all that good stuff. And then sales says, how are we going to sell this? It's ass backwards. Absolutely it is. I mean, so if you could have a structure so that all those four silos could have a common vocabulary, you could actually create offerings that people want to buy. And I think that marketing in today's environment is getting much more like a salesperson. They're all push strategies. Create the offering, now let's push it to the market. And buyers are getting more sophisticated. It would be much better if you could have a pull strategy because your market actually reflected what the market wanted.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Is there an industry or any key market segments that you look to when you're trying to define the ideal customer profile for customer-centric selling?
I would say that it's probably a fairly big ticket, high technology, and part of that is that most of our business partner channel, we have backgrounds in technology. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what we've gravitated to. But I've really worked with a very diverse group of clients. I mean, relocations, a ground-based overnight delivery service, a temporary housing company. What I find in more of the commodity type products, the salesperson makes a bigger difference. And it's very interesting. And some of these.
That is interesting. That's not intuitive, right? I mean, most people would sort of punt and say, well, procurement's going to drive this, or it's an RFP process. How does a salesperson influence a commoditized buying environment?
They actually have to get to usage. And I'll tell you, off the top of my head, I'll try, but the ground-based delivery service was fascinating to me. Because when I started out with them, I asked how they went about selling. They'd just knock on doors. They'd talk to the receptionist or whomever and say, hey, how'd you like to save money on your overnight deliveries to these 3 states? Now, when they never heard of the company and they say cheaper, of course, you immediately think that's commodity and probably the service or whatever is not going to be good. So we had a look, and I had helped them identify 7 differentiators. They were ground-based. They could deliver to pallets. They had a higher weight limit. They could deliver to an address, like a construction site or location versus an address. They could pick up as early as 7 a.m., as late as 8 p.m., and deliver as early as 7. And there was one more that's escaping me. But what we did is we said, okay, we got to look at how you're going to sell this. So one of their verticals are law firms. So we really modified the methodology quite a bit. The question became, what's important to you when choosing an overnight delivery service? And of course, everyone would say, price and performance and all that stuff. And then they would say, well, would one of your requirements be that if you had a critical document you're working on, it could be picked up as late as 8 o'clock in the evening rather than 5 o'clock? Almost everyone said yes. Would it be important to you that it could be delivered, that same document could be delivered as early as 7 o'clock in the morning the next morning? Most people would say yes. We then went to ground-based and something about if an airport's closed, you can't deliver it. That was a throwaway, but we did it so they could realize ground-based should be less expensive than whatever. And then the last one was interesting. The last one was to save money, but we started to realize a law firm, if they're doing cost plus, they have no incentive. So it became on documents you would select, would you like the ability, use it ground-based, and actually pay less money? So it took it away from a commodity. And really, when you think of a law firm, what's the value of 3 additional hours? Could be whether or not you're going to win or lose a client. Could be whether or not the contract goes out correct versus with mistakes. So, Todd, a commodity becomes a commodity because salespeople allow it to go that way.
When you engage with an organization, what do you typically run into? Right? What are the 3 things that are always there that you're going to have to address early on? Not in terms of education, but in terms of actually helping them implement the change that's required to drive from a customer-centric standpoint?
You really have to get senior management commitment. I mean, I think if there's any one variable, it's that commitment. And I invariably, I offer a free seat to a CEO. I figure if he or she, I don't want to charge them because they probably won't be in there for the whole, session. But when the management team and the salespeople realize the CEO has been through the workshop or at least knows the language, it's very different. The next thing is we have to get sales and marketing somewhat aligned because we create what we call sales-ready messaging. Mm-hmm. And what it amounts to is helping salespeople position based upon the title and desired business outcome of the person they're calling on. And then the last thing is first-level managers. Salespeople do what you inspect, not what you expect. And they have to really drive the process by example. And they have to, really lean on people that might be resistant to change.
We asked some of our clients in the LinkedIn community if they had any questions we could ask on their behalf. The most popular type of question was about the relevancy of a methodology like customer-centric selling when they run up against a formal competitive RFP process. Do you have a recommendation for those situations?
Sure. I mean, I've come to despise RFPs. When I first started selling for IBM as the earth cooled, I'm on the job for 2 months, and I'm in Groton, Connecticut, and there's an RFP that comes in from the Coast Guard Academy in New London. They want 2 data input devices, total purchase price $6,000. I had to respond to this RFP. I had to post a surety bond. I won the business. And I swear to God, I made like $1.37 an hour if you really netted the whole thing. And I won. So RFPs, there's two RFPs. Good ones are ones that you wired. The bad ones are ones that somebody else wired. I'd say you probably have an 85-90% chance of winning the ones you wired. I think you have less than a 5% chance traditionally responding. So the recommendation is really consistent within CCS. If it's a sales call, the first person you contact, you try to qualify them as a champion. If it's an RFP that you didn't wire, call the person. Todd, I want to compliment you on what a great job you did on the RFP. I want to do the same thorough job in responding. In order for me to do that, I would need to have either a phone call or a meeting with, name 3 titles that are executive level titles. Mm-hmm. The person probably will either say no or hell no. Right. And what's that for? Well, I'm not a quote and hope sort of guy. And the fact is, rather than just throw a number your way, if I don't understand the business issues, I really can't do my job. So can I have access? Sometimes they'll say yes. If you get access, interesting things happen. If you don't, then make sure you write them a letter just indicating you didn't refuse. You just could not bid if you couldn't have access to those people. Mm-hmm. And, RFPs, there's a lot of people, I'd love to do prospecting, but geez, I got this RFP and the words, it looks like it was written for us. Let me know how that works out, Sparky.
Why does CCS remain one of the primary methodologies that people are turning to?
I think it's based upon the way people buy. I think that it truly is a process because in my mind, for a process, you've got to have standard milestones and oftentimes sets of milestones for different transactions. You need a common skill set because there's cannot and there's will not. The skill set has to be in place for people to execute and achieve milestones. You need messaging. How are they going to make a call? How are they going to position offerings? And lastly, it's got to be auditable. So there has to be a way to document calls in a way that a manager can grade pipeline. And I think beyond that, at least in my mind, we've done a pretty good job of trying to help people understand how to make calls on knowledgeable buyers, because it's not easy.
In addition to being an author, you're also an entrepreneur who started a business in 2002, and you've grown it to a global presence. Let's spend a little bit of time on that. What was more rewarding to you? Was it early success of the consulting company, the fact that you knew you could grow something, the release of the book? Where have the most satisfying moments come with the evolution of customer-centric selling?
I'd say 2 things. The first one is the acceptance and successes of our customers. I mean, that's just validation. You come up with a methodology, but, early on, you got to see where it's going. The other one, Todd, is through the years, I've had salespeople call me years after a workshop and tell me that the workshop changed his life and his career and all that good stuff. And so what I get most enjoyment out of in workshops is when experienced people say, gee, this was really good, really different. I mean, most of the new people, no offense to them, it's like ice cream, that's all good. But the real gratification comes when someone's been selling 20 years, comes up to you and says, I wish I had this 20 years ago.
Is there a favorite stage of business for you to work with, an early stage or a mature organization? Where do you find the greatest joy?
Well, I think that, we have the ability to have a huge impact on startup types with figuring out who's going to buy, why they're going to buy. The challenge is, in terms of training, their requirements are minimal. But I would say, beyond that, it's just all over the place. And, the good process is the one that you choose and the one that you implement. So, and I think companies have to realize that. It's interesting to me how hard it is for people to buy sales training. It's very hard for people to really evaluate, compare, and sort of interesting.
Is there a particular mark or set of criteria that you use to sort of gauge success and failure when you get engaged with an organization?
We try to define specific baselines of where they are before the training.
So true to the methodology.
Yeah. And one of the more remarkable ones, I mentioned a company that did corporate relocations.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the statistics, their win rate went from 18 to 37%. Their average transaction went from 40,000 to 70,000.
Hmm.
The time for a new hire to close their first sale was reduced by 75%. They were actually, because they were outsourcing, they were actually using the forecast to hire staff because it was the Fortune 1000 companies.
That's how predictable it became.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Now, there's a new, I mentioned financial impact selling.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the process of actually revisiting success stories, and I've come up with a new number called RROI, Revenue Return on Investment. And what we're actually doing is calculating how much top-line revenue companies have realized for every dollar they spend. And we've done one calculation with a relocation company, $346.50. And I'm trying, we have some showcase accounts with great success stories, but I'm working to actually do the calculations for as many of those as we can.
And if that's a small business, apply a multiple for the liquidity event.
I like the way you think.
At this point in your career or in the business's development, have you gotten to the point where you're either able to or willing to say no more often in terms of particular client engagement opportunities?
Yeah. I can't say I haven't had some drive-by situations, and a drive-by to me is, see, I don't like to think of it as training. It really is supposed to be behavior modification that becomes part of the sales culture. But, there have been some. One in particular was amazing to me. CEO went through the workshop and just there was very little implementation effort. And, sales process does not implement itself.
When you're developing things like financial impact selling or RROI, what do you do to test those hypotheses? Is there a particular process you go through with certain clients, or how do you validate the information before you publish it?
What I typically will do, I've got several contacts. I have them usually review things that I might write. I have people reviewing some chapters of the book that I'm writing. And, I love to get their input because, of course, anything you write you think is wonderful. And, if they can poke some holes in it, I just didn't find out before it's published.
Last question. What advice would you give your 30-year-old self?
Ooh. Don't be afraid to self-promote. My parents brought me up to think you just did your job and you get recognized. And probably as a 30-year-old, I took that philosophy and probably should have been a little bit better at self-promoting.
Hey, all right. So I should wrap up and say, John, thanks a lot. Thanks for taking the time to come in tonight and have the conversation. Really appreciate it. It's always good to see you.
I enjoyed it.
I really hope you enjoyed that conversation and consider it to be time well spent. If so, please share it with your colleagues. In any event, we'd appreciate your feedback, good or bad, so the team here can make the show as solid as it can be. You can find us and subscribe on iTunes, SoundCloud, or YouTube at the Growth Minded Podcast channel. You can also find our blog site at growthminded.io or on Twitter, and our handle is @growthminded.io. Until next time, thanks so much for taking your time to listen to the Growth Minded Podcast.